The heat of the kitchen was a familiar beast, a humid press of steam and sizzling fat that clung to Allura's skin. Out on the floor of Ginza Prime, the air was chilled to the precise temperature of expensive wine, a different kind of pressure. Here, perfection was the only acceptable currency. She moved through the maze of tables, a ghost in a crisp black uniform, her posture straight, her smile a carefully constructed piece of armor. For 2 years, she had mastered the art of being present but invisible, a seamless part of the restaurant's luxurious machinery. Tonight, however, an invisible string kept pulling her attention to the corner booth, the one shrouded in the deepest shadows. 3 men sat there, their presence sucking the sound from the air around them. 2 were walls of muscle in dark suits, utterly still. The third, the man at the center, was the source of the silence. She hadn't seen his face clearly, only impressions. The severe cut of a charcoal suit that probably cost more than her degree. The glint of a platinum watch. And his hands. She kept noticing his hands. They rested on the table, one on either side of a glass of whiskey, and they were unnervingly elegant. Long fingers, immaculate nails, and from the edge of his left cuff, a sliver of intricate blue and black ink curled around his wrist like a living vine. Her colleague, a seasoned waiter named Ren, had brushed past her earlier, his face pale. "Don't stare," he'd murmured. Table 7 is Kaido Tanaka. The name meant nothing to her, but the fear in Ren's eyes was a language she understood perfectly. So she didn't stare. She refilled their water glasses without meeting anyone's eyes. She described the specials in a calm, even tone that betrayed none of the unease prickling at the back of her neck. Mr. Tanaka ordered for the table without looking at the menu, his voice a low baritone that was quieter than the restaurant's ambient hum, yet it cut through everything. The meal passed in a tense, silent rhythm. When the time came to clear the final plates, the bill had already been paid by one of the suited walls with a featureless black card. All that remained was a single, empty whiskey glass and the man himself, watching her. For the first time, she felt the full weight of his gaze. His eyes were dark, almost black, and held a stillness that was ancient and predatory. As she reached for the glass, he slid something across the polished mahogany. It was a thick, rectangular block of yen, held together by a simple paper band. It wasn't a few bills folded discreetly. It was a brick of cash, so substantial it was obscene. It was enough to pay her rent for the next 12 months. Enough to erase her student loans. It was too much. A hot, sharp anger sliced through her professional calm. This wasn't a tip. A tip was appreciation for service. This was a statement. A transaction. It felt filthy, as if he were trying to buy the space she occupied, the air she breathed. She placed her silver tray on the table and pushed the block of money back toward him. Her movements were small, precise. "The service charge is included on your bill, sir," she said, her voice dangerously quiet. He didn't move. His dark eyes remained fixed on her, unblinking. The silence stretched, becoming a physical thing that pressed down on her. One of his men shifted, a subtle threat. Allura held her ground. "This is inappropriate." The words were out before she could stop them, sharper than she intended. She saw a flicker of something in his eyes, not anger, but a kind of detached curiosity. It made her bolder. "I'm not for sale." The temperature in the room plummeted. The 2 men beside him went rigid, their hands disappearing inside their jackets. Ren, who was serving a nearby table, froze mid-pour. But Kaido Tanaka didn't react. He simply inclined his head, a gesture so minuscule it was almost imaginary. It was a dismissal. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she picked up her tray and walked away, feeling his gaze on her back like a physical weight. She didn't look back. She spent the next hour on autopilot, her hands shaking so slightly only she could tell. She had just insulted one of the most powerful men in Tokyo. Her life in the city, her carefully constructed quiet, felt like it was about to shatter. When her shift finally ended, she changed out of her uniform, pulling on a simple sweater and jeans, wanting nothing more than to disappear into the anonymity of the late-night train. She slipped out the staff entrance into the narrow, damp alley behind the restaurant. Anne stopped. One of the walls from Table 7 stood there, blocking her path. He was somehow larger in the confined space, a mountain in a suit. He wasn't looking at her, but at the far end of the alley, yet she knew he was there for her. "Excuse me," she said, her voice tight. He turned his head slowly. His face was a mask of polite indifference. "Miss Hale." He knew her name. A cold dread, sharp and metallic, flooded her veins. "Mr. Tanaka would like a word," the man said. It wasn't a request. In private, the alley suddenly felt like a cage. The distant sounds of Shinjuku's nightlife seemed to fade away, leaving only the sound of her own breathing. That was the moment everything changed. The ordinary world fell away, and she was left standing at the edge of a chasm, with Kaito Tanaka on the other side, waiting. She had refused his money. Now, it seemed he intended to collect a different kind of debt. The black sedan was a void of silence on wheels. Allure sat stiffly against the plush leather, as far from him as the space would allow. Kaito Tanaka sat opposite her, the city's neon lights sliding across the planes of his face, illuminating a sharp jawline, the severe line of his mouth. He hadn't spoken since she'd been ushered into the car. He simply watched her, his stillness a weapon. "Why?" he finally asked. The word was soft, yet it landed with the force of a physical blow. Allure stared out the window at the blur of color and light. "I already told you. It was inappropriate. It was generous. It was an insult," she countered, turning to face him. The defiance felt foolish, like a mouse roaring at a hawk, but it was all she had. It implied that my dignity had a price tag. "You weren't tipping me for my service. You were trying to buy my subservience." He considered this, his head tilted slightly. "You see the world with sharp edges. I see it for what it is." The car turned, leaving the main thoroughfare and gliding into a quieter, darker street lined with high stone walls. It stopped before a set of massive, unmarked wooden gates that swung open without a sound. They were admitting them into a world hidden in plain sight. The house was not what she expected. There was no gaudy display of wealth. Instead, it was a masterpiece of traditional Japanese architecture, all dark wood, paper screens, and serene, raked gravel courtyards. It was a place of immense, ancient calm that felt completely at odds with the man who owned it. He led her through a corridor that opened onto a veranda overlooking a magnificent garden. A large pond, filled with enormous, jewel-toned koi, was the centerpiece. The only sound was the gentle splash of a bamboo fountain. "My world is not a place for that kind of principle," he said, looking out at the water. "Integrity is a liability. It can be used against you." He spoke as if he were discussing the weather, but his words were heavy with a past she couldn't see. He turned his gaze from the pond to her. "I knew a woman once. A cellist. She had the same fire in her eyes, the same refusal to bend." Allure said nothing, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. This felt like a test, a story with a purpose she didn't yet understand. She believed that the beauty of her music could exist separately from the world that paid to hear it, he continued, his voice losing some of its detached quality. "A rival of mine, a man from the Hashimoto clan, saw her integrity not as a virtue, but as a lever. He tried to force her to act as an informant. He threatened her mentor, an old man who had taught her everything." Kaito looked at Allure, and for a moment, the mask of control slipped. She saw a flicker of raw, unresolved pain. She refused. "Instead of coming to me, instead of allowing herself to be a pawn in our game, she walked away from her career, from everything she had ever worked for. He had her blacklisted. She never played professionally again. I could have protected her, but her pride, her principles, would not allow her to ask. I failed to see the danger until it was too late." He wasn't just telling a story. He was drawing a line between that woman and Allure. He was giving her a warning. Before she could process it, a subtle shift occurred in the atmosphere. The gentle sound of the fountain was suddenly the only sound. Kaito's head lifted, his body going taut. One of his men appeared at the edge of the veranda, his hand inside his jacket. He gave a short, sharp nod. Chaos erupted, but it was a quiet, disciplined chaos. There were no shouts, no gunfire. Just the sickening, soft thud of bodies, the whisper of blades clearing leather. Assassins. Here. Kaido moved faster than she could have imagined. One moment he was by the railing, the next his hand was clamped around her arm, pulling her off the veranda and into a narrow, dark hallway behind a sliding screen. He pushed her against the wall, his body a solid shield in front of hers. The space was so small she was pressed against the entire length of him, the hard muscle of his chest, the solid strength of his thighs. She could feel the coiled power in him, the complete absence of fear. His scent filled her senses, hinoki wood, expensive wool, and something else, something like cold steel and smoke. "Stay behind me. Do not make a sound," he breathed, his lips so close to her ear she felt the warmth of his words on her skin. The sounds of the fight were muffled but brutal. She could hear the grunt of exertion, the wet, ugly sound of a blade finding its mark. Through it all, Kaido remained perfectly still, a predator listening to the sounds of the hunt. His focus was absolute, his presence an anchor in the terrifying storm. This was his language. This was his world. The fighting subsided as quickly as it began. A heavy silence fell over the compound. After a long moment, Kaido relaxed his stance by a fraction, though he didn't move away from her. The heat of his body was still a brand against hers. One of his lieutenants, a grim-faced man with a scar bisecting his eyebrow, appeared in the doorway. He bowed his head. "It is done. 5 of them. From the Hashimoto clan." Kaido nodded, then finally stepped back, putting a cool foot of air between them. Allure felt the loss of his presence, like a sudden chill. The lieutenant looked at her, his expression unreadable. "We can take you from here," he said, his voice respectful but firm. "A car is waiting. It will take you to a hotel, and then to the airport in the morning. You will be given enough money to start a new life, anywhere you choose. You will never have to see any of us again." It was an exit. A clean break. The smart choice. The sane choice. She could walk away right now and pretend the last few hours never happened. She could go back to her life of invisible efficiency, of quiet survival. She looked at Kaido. He was already turned away, speaking in low tones to his man, his profile carved from stone in the dim light. He wasn't looking at her. He expected her to go. He was offering her the escape the cellist never had. But running felt like a betrayal of the woman who had stood her ground in the restaurant. Running felt like leaving a part of herself behind in this dark, silent house. She thought of the story he'd told her, of the failure he still carried.
"No," she said.
Both men turned to look at her. "I'll stay." The decision hung in the air, a choice made of something more than survival instinct. It was a step across a line she knew she could never uncross. Kaido's dark eyes locked on hers, and for the first time, she saw not a predator, but a man caught in a cage of his own making. And she had just voluntarily stepped inside it with him. The immediate threat had passed, but the danger now had a name. The Hashimoto clan. And they knew Kaido had been with her. In the cold calculus of his world, her presence had become a complication, a loose thread in the tightly woven tapestry of his empire. She was no longer just a witness. She was a target. Kaido installed her in a suite of rooms within the compound, a gilded cage of silk screens and polished cypress wood. The days that followed were a study in tension. She was a ghost in his house, surrounded by his men, who treated her with a detached, formal respect. Kaido himself was a fleeting presence, a shadow in the halls, a quiet authority she felt more than saw. The silence between them was not empty. It was filled with the unspoken consequences of her choice to stay. One afternoon, seeking refuge from the suffocating stillness of her rooms, she explored the residential wing of the house. She found a door slightly ajar and pushed it open, revealing a study. Unlike the rest of the house, this room was starkly Western. Leather armchairs, a heavy desk, and shelves filled with books on history and military strategy. But it was the wall behind the desk that drew her in. It was covered in framed photographs. Most were old, black and white pictures of stern-faced men in traditional attire. But one, a more recent color photograph, stood out. It was a woman with a cello, her head tilted, a small, sad smile on her lips. Her hair was different, her features sharper, but the expression in her eyes, it was the same defiant fire Allure saw in her own reflection. It was the cellist. The resemblance was close enough to be a punch to the gut. A cold, sickening dread washed over her. Was that all she was to him? A replacement? A ghost he was trying to resurrect? The thought was humiliating, a violation far deeper than his offer of money. She was still standing there, staring at the photograph, when he entered the room. He stopped when he saw her, his face impassive, but she could see the tightening of the muscles in his jaw. Who was she? Allure asked, her voice shaking with a cold anger. She didn't need to point. Her name was Aiko, he said. She looks like me, it wasn't a question. He walked to the window, his back to her. The resemblance is what made me notice you in the restaurant.
I will not lie about that.
The admission was brutal, a clean cut. So, what am I? Some kind of stand-in? Are you trying to fix your past mistake with a new toy? He turned around slowly, and the cold control in his eyes was gone, replaced by a raw, burning intensity she had never seen before. He crossed the room in 2 long strides, stopping directly in front of her. He was so close she had to crane her neck to look up at him. Aiko was quiet, he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. Where you're loud. She was gentle. You are sharp. She bent to the will of others to protect them. You refused to bend for anyone. She was my greatest regret, he paused, his gaze dropping to her mouth before snapping back to her eyes. You are my greatest problem. It was the most honest thing he had ever said to her. It wasn't a compliment. It was a confession. He wasn't trying to replace Aiko. He was captivated by the ways Allure was different, and it terrified him. The tension between them shifted, becoming something sharp, electric, and undeniable. The Hashimoto clan did not wait long to make their next move.
But they were smarter this time.
They didn't attack the fortress, where Kaido lived. They went after the life she'd left behind. She had convinced Kaido to let one of his men escort her to her tiny apartment to collect her passport and a few personal items. It was supposed to be a quick, clean extraction. But as she was packing a small bag, the front door splintered inward. 2 men burst in, their faces grim, their intent unmistakable. Her escort moved to intercept them, a blur of motion and violence in the cramped space. Allure didn't freeze. Adrenaline, cold and pure, flooded her system. While the 3 men were locked in a brutal struggle, she grabbed the kettle of water she'd just boiled for tea and threw it. The scalding liquid hit one of the intruders in the face. He screamed, a high, agonized sound, stumbling back. She used the opening not to run, but to grab the heaviest skillet she owned, swinging it with all her might into the second man's knee. There was a sickening crack. It bought them seconds, nothing more. One of the men, recovering, lunged for her. But just as his fingers brushed her arm, the apartment was suddenly full of Kaido's men. The fight was over almost before it began. When Kaido himself swept into the room, his face was a pale, rigid mask of fury. His eyes scanned the scene, the chaos, her protector bleeding from a cut on his arm, the 2 intruders subdued on the floor. Then his gaze found her, standing by the stove, skillet still in her hand, her knuckles white. He crossed to her, and for a split second, the mask slipped. She saw raw, undisguised fear in his eyes. A fear for her. It vanished as quickly as it appeared, replaced by his usual cold command. But she had seen it. They captured one of the Hashimoto men alive. Back at the compound, he was dragged into the dojo. Kaido was going to interrogate him personally. Allure watched from the doorway as the man was forced to his knees. He looked up, saw her, and a nasty, sneering grin split his bruised face. He spat a string of curses at her, vile threats against her and her family back in America, whom he promised his clan would find. Something inside Allure snapped. The fear, the anger, the violation, it all coalesced into a single point of ice-cold rage. The waitress from Ginza Prime, The woman who believed in principles and propriety vanished. She walked past Kaido's guards, her heels clicking on the wooden floor. She stopped before Kaido, who was watching her with a hooded, unreadable expression. "Let me ask him the first question," she said, her voice devoid of all emotion. Kaido stared at her for a long moment, then gave a single, sharp nod. Allure knelt in front of the captured man, meeting his hateful glare. She leaned in close, so only he could hear her. "You think you can scare me by threatening my family?" she whispered, her voice a silken thread of venom. "When your boss finds out you failed, that you were captured because a waitress fought back, he won't just kill you. He'll erase you. Your name, your family, your honor. It will be as if you never existed. But before he does that," she continued, her voice dropping even lower, "I will personally send him a list of every living relative you have. And I will make sure he knows you gave them to me. To save yourself." The man's bravado crumbled. The color drained from his face, replaced by a stark, primal terror. He started to shake. Allure stood up and walked away without a backward glance. She had crossed a line. She had used their rules, their codes of honor and fear, against them. She was no longer just a victim in their world. She was a player. Later that night, he found her by the koi pond, staring at the iridescent scales of the fish gliding through the inky water. The adrenaline was gone, leaving behind a hollow, aching coldness. He came to stand beside her, not speaking for a long time. The air was cool, fragrant with the smell of damp earth and pine. "You should have run when you had the chance," he said finally, his voice rough. She turned to face him, the moonlight catching the defiant tilt of her chin. "I told myself staying was for survival," she said, her voice perfectly steady. "I was lying to myself." The admission hung between them, more intimate than a touch, more dangerous than any weapon. It was a confession not of love, but of allegiance. An acknowledgement that her reasons for being here had everything to do with the man beside her, and nothing to do with escape. He held her gaze, and in the depths of his dark eyes, she saw a flicker of something possessive, something absolute. He had seen the darkness in her, and he wasn't afraid of it. He was claiming it. The final move came, as Kaido predicted it would. The head of the Hashimoto clan requested a meeting at a neutral location, a high-end tea house in Akasaka, to discuss a truce. It was a lie. A child could see the trap, a transparent ploy to draw Kaido out into the open. He intended to walk right into it. "It is a matter of face," he explained to her in his study, the night before the meeting. He was tracing lines on a blueprint of the tea house. "If I refuse, I show fear. He will use it to turn my own captains against me. I must go. And I must be the only one who walks out." "It's an ambush," Allure stated, her voice flat. "He'll have the place surrounded." "I know." "And what about here?" she pressed, a cold knot of certainty tightening in her stomach. "If he's drawing you and your best men across the city, what's to stop him from sending a second team here? To finish what the others started." She was the unfinished business, the source of his distraction. Kaido's eyes met hers. He didn't deny it. "My head of security, Ishikawa, will remain here with a full guard. You will be safe." But Allure knew safety was an illusion. Hiding and waiting for rescue was a fool's game. She had learned that much. That night, after Kaido left to make his final preparations, she sought out Ishikawa. He was an older man, his face a roadmap of hard-won battles, but his eyes held a quiet intelligence. He had watched her since she arrived, his initial suspicions slowly morphing into a grudging respect. "He thinks you can protect me by hiding me," she said to Ishikawa in the quiet of the dojo. "But the best defense is not to hide. It's to make them believe there is nothing to find." She laid out her plan. It was simple, born from her years of watching people in the restaurant. She knew how to anticipate movement, how to use expectations against someone. The assassins would expect to find a terrified woman under heavy guard in the most secure part of the house. They would be looking for a fight. She would give them nothing of the sort. When Kaido's car pulled away the next evening, the compound fell into a deceptive calm. Allure had Ishikawa remove the guards from the residential wing, hiding them in the shadows of the garden. The house was left looking quiet, vulnerable. She herself put on a simple silk robe and sat not in a panic room, but on the veranda overlooking the koi pond, a pot of tea on the table beside her. She was the bait. They came just after midnight, ghosts in black, moving through the garden with silent, deadly efficiency. They bypassed the empty guard posts, their confidence growing with every undefended step. They saw her, a lone woman sitting in the moonlight, seemingly oblivious. She was too easy a target. It had to be a trap. Their training screamed at them to be cautious. But she didn't move. She just poured a cup of tea, her hand perfectly steady. Her calm was more unnerving than any army. They hesitated, confused. That hesitation was all Ishikawa's men needed. The attack came from the darkness they had felt so safe in. It was swift, brutal, and decisive. Allure never moved from her seat. She listened to the short, sharp sounds of the fight, her gaze fixed on the moon's reflection in the water. She was not the one holding the blade, but this was her victory. Kaido returned hours later, just before dawn. He wore the same immaculate suit, but she could smell the faint, metallic tang of blood on him. He found her in the garden, where she was standing by the pond's edge, watching the first light of day paint the sky in shades of gray and rose. Ishikawa met him first, bowing low and explaining what had happened in a few concise sentences. Kaido's eyes found Allure. He walked toward her, his steps measured, his face unreadable. He stopped in front of her, his gaze sweeping over her, searching for any sign of injury. He reached out, his fingers gently brushing a faint, healing scratch on her cheek from the attack in her apartment. Then he took her hands. They were cold. He held them, his thumbs stroking the backs of her knuckles. He didn't offer words of praise or relief. He offered something more. From this day, he said, his voice a low, solemn vow that echoed in the morning stillness, this house is yours. Your word is my own. Your safety is the clan's first law. It was not a declaration of love. It was a coronation. In his world of blood and loyalty, he was giving her a throne. He was acknowledging her not as a woman he needed to protect, but as a queen who could protect herself. He was binding her to him with the only thing that truly mattered in his life: power. The cost of that power was steep. The woman who had indignantly refused a stack of cash because it offended her principles was gone forever. In her place was someone who could plan an ambush and listen to men die without flinching. She had traded her ordinary life for a seat at the heart of an empire of shadows. He didn't release her hands. He simply stood with her, two silent figures against the rising sun. The water in the pond before them was still and clear, reflecting the new day. She looked from the water to his face, at the man who saw all the darkness she had discovered within herself and called it strength. She didn't pull away. She met his gaze and held it, her choice as clear and unshakable as the dawn.